On the next episode of DevOps Lab, me and Garvita, we're going to explore not only the power of Azure Stack Hub, but how we can still do DevOps best practices into Azure Stack Hub using GitHub Actions. Welcome to the DevOps Lab. I am super excited to have Garvita Ray with us today. And what are we going to do? We're going to be talking about GitHub Actions on Azure Stack Hub. So welcome to the show, Garvita. I am so happy to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Absolutely. So why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself?
So I'm Garvita. I'm a graduate from the University of Waterloo. Straight out of college, I joined Microsoft as a product manager on the Intelligent Edge team. During my first year, I've worked on cognitive services, DevOps, most importantly. So one of the amazing projects that I've got to release is the launch of GitHub Actions on Azure Stack Hub.
Mm-hmm. So before we begin, what exactly is Azure Stack Hub?
Azure Stack Hub is an extension of Azure. It's essentially allowing customers to run Azure services on-prem in their own data centers. An example of a company that might use Azure Stack Hub would be a financial institution or a bank that are required by regulation to keep their data locally.
Okay, so that's like super cool, right? Because we can have companies that are not allowed to use the public cloud, and they have to use their own data center, but within their own data center, if I'm hearing you correctly, using Azure Stack Hub, they basically have like a slice of Azure running inside their own data center. So they can use all the goodness of Azure. Is that correct?
Exactly. They're still able to take advantage of Azure and still meet all their compliance regulations.
Okay, so I love this. Now, of course, you know I'm a DevOps guy. Am I able to still use DevOps best practices to build and deploy my apps into Azure Stack Hub?
Yes. So we used to offer Azure pipelines and Azure repositories as the main DevOps tooling for Azure Stack Hub. But recently, just in the past month, we've released GitHub Action support. So now you're able to deploy to Azure Stack Hub, log in, run CLI commands, and a bunch of other use cases using GitHub Actions.
Okay, that sounds pretty cool to me. Can you show this to me?
Of course. So let me go through a demo of a workflow. So this is a login workflow that you can use to log into your Azure Stack Hub. You can think of this workflow in two parts. So there's the event that will trigger the workflow, and then there are the different actions that you want to run once the event occurs. So in this case, we're using push as our trigger. So anytime there's a code push to this repository, this workflow will run. But depending on your use case, you can set this to be on a pull request, and you could even specify different branches that you want this workflow to run on. And the action that we're using in this case is the login action. There are two things that you do if you want to run the login action on Azure Stack Hub. You need to specify your service principal that you want to use to log in. So that will just be a secret stored in your repository. And you want to set the environment to Azure Stack.
Okay, so let me just make sure I'm getting this right, because I'm looking at your YAML file, and it looks like you're using plain old GitHub, right? Nothing special about that. This is GitHub on github.com, and you're running on their agent, which is an Ubuntu agent. You're just using this action, the login action, and just by using this action, this logs you into your Azure Stack that's running in your data center?
Exactly, and you're able to run any Azure CLI command that you would regularly, or even PowerShell commands.
Cool, okay. This is starting to make sense to me, because now if I can log in and I can use the Azure CLI, I can pretty much do any DevOps things that I need to deploy my app, right? Just by using the Azure CLI.
Exactly.
All right, show me more. This is awesome.
And the other advantage of GitHub Actions is the super detailed logs you get from the workflow. So for the workflow that we just went through, here's kind of the logs generated by the login action. As you can see, super detailed, a very step-by-step of what's happening in the background. And here's the output of the Azure CLI commands that we ran.
Very cool. All right, so this example, that's pretty cool. You proved to me that this works, right? I can log into Azure Stack from my GitHub Actions, but I'm still, I don't know. I'm not sure I'm completely convinced. Can you do something a little more complex? Like, can we actually build and deploy something?
For sure. So
Okay.
I wanted to use this action because it'll be a building block for a lot of developers, but we actually have a more cooler demo. So the next demo I want to go through is where we take a image from a container registry stored in Azure, and we're deploying it to a K8 cluster in Azure Stack. This is a really great hybrid example where you're leveraging both the public and the private cloud. It's also a really good example of how you can have your application stored in one place, but deploy to different edge locations.
Okay, so this is super, super cool. Can we drill in and see what's really happening?
For sure. Let's go through the workflow file.
Okay.
So in this workflow, again, we're using push as our trigger. But unlike the last workflow, we have a bunch of different actions that we're leveraging to complete this workflow file. So you have the Kubernetes stack context, and then we're actually creating a secret that will have access to your ACR, which is where we're pulling the image from. And finally, we're deploying to our K8 cluster.
Cool. All right, so this is now doing real stuff, but did it work? Well, it looks like everything's green. Did it really deploy?
Let's look at our build logs.
Okay.
So here are the logs, and if we go to the deploy action, you can see all the different commands that it's running in the background. And finally, at the bottom, we have a deploy succeeded command somewhere.
It's buried in the log file.
But here's the IP address that we can use to check out what's been deployed.
Okay.
As you can see, we have a cat and dogs voting application.
Nice, nice. So you did all of this. Let me just recap just to make sure I understood everything that I just saw. So you've got Azure Stack running in your own data center, which is like a little slice of Azure running in your own data center. And within your Azure Stack Hub, you've got a Kubernetes cluster running. And your source code is held in github.com. And using actions, you're able to log into your stack, then using the Azure CLI and also using some actions that are already pre-built by Microsoft, you're able to deploy your application, your cat and dog application, into that Kubernetes cluster in your Azure Stack that's running in your data center.
Exactly. And the advantage for bigger companies is that you can even deploy across different locations using the same source code, using the same workflow file.
Wow, this is really, really cool stuff. Thank you so much for that, Garvita. This was super informative. Like having the ability to run a slice of Azure in your own data center using Azure Stack Hub is super crazy powerful, and especially for industries and companies that just don't let you use the public cloud. And even with your apps running in Azure Stack Hub, you can still use DevOps best practices using GitHub Actions on Azure Stack Hub. Now, as a DevOps guy, that makes me crazy, ridiculously happy. So if you need more information about this, check out the links below and join us next week on the DevOps Lab for even more DevOpsy goodness.